Hello, I'm Nicole Gauthier, plant pathologist at the University of Kentucky. Today we're going to talk about tomato blight or blighting diseases of tomato. So tomato blight is a symptom. We use it to describe a specific symptom on not just tomatoes, but as a plant disease on multiple crops. So what is blight? What does blight mean? The definition of blight means severely detrimental. But in the plant pathology world, we use the word blight to describe a rapid death, usually so rapid that the leaves remain intact. So you'll see those brown leaves clinging on to the plant. So this is not defoliation. So it's not leaf drop and it's not a mold, but it's again that rapid death where those brown leaves hang on to the plant for at least some amount of time. Then what is tomato blight? There's no such disease, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So blight is a symptom. The word blight is in the name of some diseases, but blight is not the name of a specific disease on tomato or otherwise. So diseases that cause blighting in tomatoes can be early blight, Septoria leaf spot, target spot, bacterial spot, southern blight, and late blight. So notice that some of those diseases have blight in the name and some do not. Some are leaf spots. So a leaf spot is not a blight, but if the leaf disease runs rampant, those leaves will take on a blighting type symptom. And I'll talk about those. So at the second half of this presentation, I will talk about these specific diseases one by one. But first, let's take a look at our approach when we think about, is this blighting? What disease could this be? So let's kind of break that down a little bit. So the first thing we're going to think about as we look at our plants and examine our blighted plants, we're going to think about the specific symptoms. What's going on? What is making these plants blight? A lot of times it's leaf spots that are coalescing. So they're expanding, coalescing, and eventually that leaf succumbs and it blights. There are also stem cankers, and we'll see southern blight as a stem canker. So girdling the stem at the ground level, so everything above that point wilts and then blights, and so you'll have those leaves remaining intact. So two different kind of diseases or types of diseases that eventually cause some blighting symptom. And while you're taking note as you're examining the garden or the field, also look at patterns. So this is patterns across the field, patterns across a plant. So is it on the upper canopy of the plant, inner canopy, leaves on the top side of the plant, on the new growth, upper canopy. So thinking about where those symptoms are, where they're starting. And then if you look at a single leaf, like for instance, if there's a leaf spot, what is the pattern on that individual leaf? Are these spots small? Do they expand really rapidly? Is there yellowing? So what are the things going on that leaf? So think about patterns very broadly and then very narrowly. Take lots of notes. So that's going to help us kind of get to the bottom of what's going on. Next, you're going to look at the progression of symptoms. So what is the rate of blighting? How quickly is it blighting? Not just the expansion of the individual spots, for example, but how fast from the time you see those early symptoms until the time you see the blighting symptoms. That's going to tell us a lot about what kind of disease might be there, and what if in fact there might be multiple causes at once. It's also really good to know the history of disease at your site. So the history of the disease this season, the history of disease last season, maybe several seasons back, and the history of the cropping in that field. So was there a crop that was also susceptible to this particular disease? Or did this disease perhaps come in on plugs or liners? Was this disease around several years and maybe this year it was just more severe? So the history of disease is really important for the site, and then have all of those notes ready as you communicate with a specialist or you communicate with your county agent. The next thing we'll almost always need to know is what kind of spray schedule you're on. Are you conventional or are you organic? How often do you spray? What are you spraying? Because sometimes what we spray is going to influence the diseases that follow. So giving that information, considering that information, again, whether you're talking to a specialist or an agent, or whether you're doing your own research to try to eliminate some of the obvious. It's also important to remember that a lot of these diseases, a lot of these symptoms look the same. The symptoms are very similar, and so I like to call those look-alike diseases. And you'll see as I talk about some of the specific blighting diseases, sometimes they look so much alike that even pathologists have problems telling them apart. So essentially, we use fungal spores, for example, and the actual pathogens to identify the causal agent of disease. And usually it's spores, and I use the word spore because fungi produce spores, and most of our plant diseases are indeed fungal, even though we have some bacterial diseases and virus diseases, water molds. But fungal spores are microscopic. All of the propagules for all of our plant pathogens are microscopic. So if we can't look at symptoms to identify, we need to look at the signs, but those signs are microscopic, then that's when we call in the professional. Our commercial growers should always use those professionals. And here in Kentucky, the Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab is the place to go. And your local extension office can help set you up and can help you submit that sample. In fact, they'll do that for you. They'll help you collect the information. And the Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab will look at spore morphology, for example. They'll look at a range of things, sometimes genetic information, but that's how the disease is going to be confirmed. And from there, that's when we will start pointing you to resources and giving recommendations. And speaking of resources, two major sources of information are the Department of Plant Pathology's website and a website we have called Veggie Scout, which is going to include a wide range of scouting guides. It's a picture book of different diseases and their symptoms. So I will link both of those sites down in the description so you can go directly there. And again, those resources are Kentucky specific. If you are watching this and you're not from Kentucky, I highly recommend that you talk to your local extension agent to find out what the best resources for your particular region. All right, so how do you manage tomato blights? So some people lump blights. Remember, they lump it into one broad category, and I'm doing that a little bit today. But tomato blighting diseases are very different. So the thing that makes management the same, let's talk about that first. Always cultural practices will help us manage disease. So cultural practices are production practices. And we can use these practices, again, to manage any disease, to manage all the blighting diseases. And these should always be a large part of your production cycle. So we first start with resistant cultivars. There's a lot of resistance out there, especially to the most common diseases. So look in your seed catalogs, look on the seed packets, and always try to pick resistance to the diseases that are the most prevalent on your farm. Secondly, 3-year rotation. So we're going to rotate out of, and in this instance, solanaceous crops. So we're not going to rotate tomato with pepper, for example. So we're going to rotate out of solanaceous crops. And in theory, we're rotating out of a host for the most common diseases. I'd rather see a grower on a 2-year rotation than no rotation at all. Ideally, it's 3. And on occasion, we might have a really persistent pathogen that will recommend a longer rotation. But in general, 3 years is a good benchmark for everyone to aim for. Deep tilling. So tilling after harvest and then again before the next crop goes in helps bury debris. And in burying that debris, it breaks down more quickly and any overwintering pathogens will be broken down with it. We use drip irrigation most of our commercial growers will use drip irrigation. And drip irrigation will prevent leaves from remaining wet, and because air circulation is going to help dry out leaves and eliminate that free water that's necessary for a disease to complete its life cycle. Air circulation, very much the same thing. Plant spacing, row spacing helps dry out those leaves, helps dry out that canopy. And again, reducing free water, reducing leaf wetness, reducing relative humidity so that the environment is not conducive for disease. And then finally, a barrier between the ground and those upper plant parts that usually comes in the line of cover crops, plastic mulch, woven ground cover, whatever barrier is necessary so that that overwintering debris, those overwintering propagules on debris and in soil don't splash back up into the canopy. So it kind of breaks that transfer of pathogens from their overwintering or oversummering stage onto the actively growing plants. Ultimately, though, we're preventing infection, right? So I've talked about what to do if the pathogen is in your field. Ideally, we would prevent that pathogen from coming in the first place, and that means selecting clean plants, clean seeds. If anything looks suspicious, don't let it in. So rejecting shipments of liners if they don't look good and you suspect disease at all. And then once, of course, that pathogen is in a field, preventing movement of soil and debris. So think about these pathogen propagules are going to hitchhike in soil, so keep from moving them into clean fields. So think of your farm in multiple zones or multiple fields. So we're going to prevent movement from maybe a contaminated field or block into a clean field or block. Okay, so here we are, we're 15 minutes in, and we're finally talking about fungicides. And I did that on purpose because fungicides are not our first line of defense. Fungicides are a great tool, but they're not our first line of defense. So after you have adopted cultural practices, after you've kept your field clean, all of those things, then if you still have disease or still need to protect against disease, fungicides are an option and a good option. So we always use fungicides preventatively. Ideally, we're going to use fungicides when we know our risk for disease is high, but before infection actually occurs. And we'll make those plans, we'll make those preventative applications based on our field history. Remember, we talked about our diagnostic lab services, your field history, previous crops, previous diseases. So based on that knowledge, and again, your local extension office can help you make these decisions using fungicides preventatively if needed. And then secondly, if you do have disease breakout, fungicides will act as a suppressant. So they will not cure disease, but they will help suppress disease for 10, 14, 21 days, never longer than 21 days. So once you stop spraying fungicides, a disease will come back, but you can use fungicides as a rescue treatment in limited situations. It will help suppress disease so that you don't have major yield losses. And so how do you know which fungicides to spray? Well, here's some more resources. Here in Kentucky, we produce the Kentucky Vegetable Production Guide. ID 36 is what we call it. So your county agent, if you talk to your local agent, will usually throw out the term ID 36. So that one is available through your local county agent, or it's available online for free as a digital version. And I will put that link down in the description. And then another resource that is similar, just formatted differently, is the Southeastern U.S. Vegetable Handbook. And we call this one SEVU. And this is the entire Southeast. So there might be some diseases and some pests in there that might not be applicable to Kentucky, but honestly, this is my favorite of the two guides because of the way it's formatted and the way it's set up. So both of those links will be down in the description. All right, so let's look at each of those tomato blighting diseases, all the ones that I talked about at the very beginning. There are 6 that are most likely to be called tomato blight here in Kentucky. So let's look at them one by one. And this is no means an exhaustive list or an exhaustive list of symptoms for each one, but it'll kind of give you an idea of some of those differences. And as you're scouting your own fields and you're taking notes, whether that's to do your own research or to talk to your county agent, these will help you in these descriptions. So let's start with possibly the most common one, early blight. Early blight disease is a fungal disease, and it can appear as early as June. It's usually July or August before we see early blight, and it can extend into September. Early blight begins as irregular spots and concentric rings will develop. And you see right in the middle of that lesion. So the lesion, you see it's just kind of a blotch, and you'll see that concentric kind of target spot or bullseye shape rings in the center. That's indicative of early blight. In general, yellow halos will develop around those lesions until the entire leaf turns yellow. And that's the point where the blighting begins. Early blight begins on lower leaves, and depending on the amount of humidity, it works its way up the plant. So you'll see that progression of symptoms from low going to about midway the canopy. If it's really rainy or the field planting is really dense, it can actually consume entire plants, but usually it stays in the bottom half. So leaves will blight and dry up and remain hanging on plants for an extended amount of time before they eventually drop. The next disease is Septoria leaf spot. And this one, as the name says, it is a leaf spot disease. It starts as a spot and it pretty much remains a spot. Septoria leaf spot can occur as early as September, but usually it's also later in the season, July, August, before we start seeing disease. And this one will start as small spots. They start dark and the centers will turn tan to whitish, so kind of bleaching out. And in the middle of those spots, you'll see some very dark little kind of dots, and that's sporulation. Very dark border. And as those spots become more numerous, they'll start to coalesce. So individual spots stay small, but as they coalesce, they'll make some large patches of necrotic tissue. We will see yellowing with Septoria leaf spot, but not as much as we'll see it in early blight. Septoria leaf spot also begins on the lower leaves, and as disease progresses, it progresses upward into the canopy. Again, leaves will turn yellow, then brown, and these will eventually fall. So you can see some defoliation eventually, but there is a blighting stage in between that leaf spot yellowing and then the defoliation. Okay, the next disease, target spot, also called Coronaspora spot. This is a later disease, and this is one, I call it a hot weather disease. This is one that's a little bit newer here in Kentucky. As we start seeing all of these hot summers, we're seeing more Coronaspora and less of some of the others. We don't start seeing the target spot or Coronaspora spot until about August, and it will go into September. So the spots are irregular, but they are kind of large spots, and they will also have concentric rings in the center of them. The only thing with Coronaspora spot is that leaves will start to get tattered. So with these tattered leaves, it kind of takes on a different look. So there will be a lot of browning, but you'll also kind of see the centers, these large spots just kind of falling out, the centers of them falling. There will be yellow halos associated with Coronaspora spot, especially as these lesions coalesce and then kind of the yellowing just runs rampant. Coronaspora spot begins on lower leaves and can spread rapidly, especially as we get summer rain. So all of these diseases need free water to complete their life cycles. So the more rain we get or the more irrigation that goes down, the higher that humidity is or the leaf wetness, and the disease can spread really rapidly. We'll see Coronaspora spot starting in the inner canopy and working its way out, but a lot of times it's in that lower half of the canopy, and it can work its way up pretty fast and consume entire plants. All right, next disease, bacterial spot. This one is caused by, guess what? A bacterium. So bacterial spot we can see as early as June, but it's usually July and on when we see bacterial spot. Bacterial diseases, including this one, requires a lot of water. So this is usually an overhead irrigation or a rainy season disease. Bacterial spot will start as small circular lesions and then they become kind of angular. They will coalesce. The centers of these spots will crack. So it'll kind of have a cracked appearance, or the little tiny centers will fall out. There is yellowing associated with bacterial spots. So you'll see these yellow halos around the spots in the image here. And then as disease spreads, the leaves will blight. And again, more blighting during rainy conditions. So if we have a hot, rainy summer, you'll tend to see bacterial spot run rampant and cause blighting. The next disease is southern blight. So southern blight, hence the name, it likes warm conditions, wet conditions. We see it later in the season, July, August, into September. With southern blight is caused by a soil-borne fungus. So this soil-borne pathogen lives in the soil. So when it infects, it's infecting the lower part of the stem, girdling it. And when it girdles it, it essentially chokes it. So the upper plant parts are not getting the water and nutrients they need to grow. So if you see an entire plant wilting or dying or blighting, looking down at the ground level, and you may have to pull back your plastic or whatever mulch you're using to see it. But with southern blight, we'll see these mycelial fans, so that white filamentous body of the fungus when there's sufficient moisture. And if you see in the image here, all these little white, tan, and red little balls, little BBs, those are sclerotia. And sclerotia are the overwintering structures of this fungus. So the sclerotia can remain viable in soils for many years. So this is not a 2 to 3 year rotation kind of disease. So those round sclerotia, there are a lot of them during wet conditions, but again, under plastic, especially if you're drip irrigating. If southern blight is, if your field has a history of southern blight, you will see it later in the season, especially as it starts getting hot. So again, entire plants wilt and die back. So that's different than the progression of a leaf disease. This is an entire plant. And our last disease that we're going to talk about is late blight. We don't see late blight very often here in Kentucky. The late blight pathogen likes cool, wet conditions, and we don't have cool, wet conditions in the summer here in Kentucky. Late blight usually comes in with flats of liners or starts. And if it's cool, if it's early in the season, so let me point out, I'm talking about late blight here. Late blight is not late, just like early blight is not early. Okay, so late blight likes cool conditions, and that usually occurs earlier in the season. We usually receive it in with our starts and liners, and late blight is more of an entire leaf kind of symptom. Irregular lesions, they'll have a pale green border, so opposite of what we've been seeing with these other leaf spots. Disease will expand rapidly when conditions are cool and wet. Entire leaves will die. One caveat with late blight is also that it's prominent on the upper canopy on the new growth. So the opposite of what we've seen. The other diseases, remember, other leaf diseases started in the lower canopy, worked their way up. This is an upper canopy disease. Again, it likes cool, wet conditions, and we don't see it very often. However, if you do a search for diseases or blighting diseases of tomato, you often come up with this one. So be cautious about what you find on a simple web search, because this one is not common here. All right, so in closing, I want to point out a couple of resources. Again, all of this will be linked in the description, but two of the main resources here in the Department of Plant Pathology are to the right. You see our departmental webpage. If you click the extension tab, you'll see a wealth of information categorized by crop type, and we have hundreds of fact sheets, spray guides, production guides, cultural calendars. It's all there. So in this case, you would click vegetables and then scroll on down. We have sections for commercial growers, sections for residential growers. And then on the left, there is a screenshot of our page that we call Veggie Scout. And Veggie Scout is just a landing page for a wide range of scouting guides. We have these hard copy guides. Most of your county agents here in Kentucky will have these hard copy guides. They're a picture book, so you can look at all the symptoms of all the diseases, pests, weeds. But on the website, you can get it as a PDF, so you can scroll through those. You can also get a mobile version. And again, the links are in the description. So back to our departmental web page. If you go into tomato, you'll see again a lot of different fact sheets and production guides. And new this year is we have commercial spray schedules for field and high tunnel solanaceous crops. So that's tomato and pepper. There's also an organic spray schedule in each of these. So we have our new organic guides rolling out right now, conventional spray guides, and those are on our departmental webpage. A couple of other resources. I mentioned your county extension office. Don't overlook your county agent. If you don't know your county agent, pop in, say hello, get to know each other. If you are a commercial grower in particular and you have a disease problem, they're probably always going to encourage you to submit a sample to the Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab. There is no charge for commercial growers here in Kentucky, but that will help us confirm what the problems are, and that will help your county agent give you recommendations, point you to the proper resources. And then finally, we have a lot of social media pages. So my handle is @KY Plant Disease, and my YouTube handle is just Nicole Gauthier. And again, all the resources will be linked down in the description. So I've talked about a lot of different resources. There is in Kentucky Pest News, which is our newsletter that everyone should subscribe to, we have an article that this QR code will take you to, which will list a wealth of resources, not just from the Department of Plant Pathology, but from other departments, from entomology, horticulture, economics, etc. And you'll have everything from our newsletters, email listservs, social media, and our website. So check that one out. And I think everything will be summed up in this article if you have any questions. And finally, I want to plug a couple of our resources. First, if you see on the left, we have a high tunnel tomato grower short course this spring 2025, and that's going to be a YouTube on demand series. So we're going to drop videos about every 2 weeks through the entire growing season this year. So if you subscribe, you'll receive emails when a new video drops. So that will be a YouTube playlist, but again, you can sign up for notifications. And then if you are a native Spanish speaker, if you know a native Spanish speaking grower, or if any workers on your farm are native Spanish speakers, check out this website. They use this QR code or the URL on the right, and that will take you to a section where, as we develop these Spanish language resources, they will be all together. So keep your eyes open for those. We do have, I think, 20 of them up at this time, and we're steadily adding more. So check out our Spanish page. So with that, thank you all very much, and best of luck this season. Thanks.